What makes a wild animal worthless? Is it its scars, its weakness, or just the fact that no one sees its true value? At a grand auction under golden chandeliers, a frail bobcat lay motionless. People glanced and muttered, "Useless, damaged." But then a young man stepped forward. He looked, not with pity, but curiosity. What did he see? And why would he buy an animal everyone rejected? No one knew, but this moment was about to change everything. A grand auction, a broken creature. The grand hall was filled with murmurs, the soft clinking of glasses, and the occasional polite laughter of the well-dressed guests. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished marble floors. This was no ordinary auction. It was a gathering of the elite, a place where rare and exotic animals were sold to the highest bidder. Some were meant for private collections, some for breeding, and others for less noble purposes. And there, in the middle of it all, lay a bobcat. Its fur was dull, matted in places, and scars ran along its body, marks of a past no one cared to know. The creature barely lifted its head, its amber eyes half-lidded, exhausted. It was young, but something about it seemed broken, weak, useless. The auctioneer, a well-dressed man with commanding presence, tapped his gavel against the podium. Next up, we have a bobcat. Wild caught, but weak. Not much use, I'd say. Bidding starts at $50. A ripple of disinterest moved through the crowd. Some chuckled, others shook their heads. $50? Who'd pay for that? That thing won't last a week. It looks sick, not worth the trouble. The auctioneer sighed, clearly wanted to move on. No one bid. This was a rare sight. Even the most unwanted animals usually found buyers, but this bobcat, it had been completely dismissed. He was about to call it off when a voice, calm, steady, cut through the murmurs. "I'll take it." Silence. Heads turned. A young man, no older than 25, stood near the back of the hall. He was dressed simply, jeans, a dark jacket, nothing like the expensive suits and gowns surrounding him. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" The young man nodded. "Yes." Someone in the crowd chuckled. "What a waste of money." Another whispered, "That kid doesn't know what he's doing." But the young man ignored them. He walked forward, handed over the cash, and approached the bobcat. For the first time, the animal lifted its head. And for a brief moment, something passed between them. Something unspoken. The young man crouched down and gently reached out. The bobcat flinched at first, but didn't move away. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "Let's get out of here." And just like that, a rejected creature found a new owner. What did he see in this broken animal? No one knew yet. But soon, the world would find out. The night air was crisp as the young man carried the frail bobcat out of the auction house. The murmurs of the wealthy bidders faded behind him. Their laughter and dismissive remarks no longer mattered. All that mattered now was the small, shivering creature in his arms. He walked toward his truck, an old but reliable vehicle parked under a dim streetlight. Gently, he placed the bobcat on a thick blanket spread across the back seat. The animal barely moved, too weak to resist, but its eyes remained locked onto him, half wary, half curious. The young man exhaled, brushing a hand through his dark hair before sitting in the driver's seat. "All right, buddy, let's get you home." As the engine rumbled to life, the bobcat let out a slow, tired sigh and rested its head on the blanket. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness, but the young man kept his focus. Every now and then, he glanced at the rear-view mirror, checking if the animal was still breathing. It was a long drive. The city lights faded behind him, replaced by the quiet solitude of the forest. Trees lined the road like silent watchers, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The young man kept one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the heating vents to push warm air toward the back seat. "You're not going to die on me," he muttered, stealing another glance at the bobcat. The animal barely moved. Its body was still frail, its breathing shallow. But it was alive. That was enough for now. Miles later, he pulled up in front of a small wooden cabin nestled deep within the trees. It wasn't grand or luxurious, just a simple home with a warm glow spilling from the windows. The young man stepped out, stretching his stiff muscles before turning back to the truck. He opened the door carefully, crouching down beside the bobcat. The creature's ears twitched slightly, but it made no effort to move away. "Let's get you inside," he murmured. Sliding his arms under the bobcat, he lifted it gently, careful not to press against its ribs. It weighed so little, just skin, fur, and bones. Inside, the cabin was warm, the scent of burning wood lingering in the air. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the walls. In one corner, a makeshift bedding area had already been prepared, a soft pile of blankets and towels, positioned close to the fire for warmth. He placed the bobcat down carefully. It blinked sluggishly, its muscles tensing as it tried to process its new surroundings. "They called you useless back there," the young man said, crouching beside it. "Said you wouldn't last." He let out a breath, shaking his head. "People see what they want to see, but I see something different." The bobcat flicked an ear as if listening. The young man reached for a small bowl of water, setting it down near the animal. The bobcat hesitated at first, but eventually leaned forward, lapping at the cool liquid. "There you go, small steps." It wasn't much. The bobcat was still weak, still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, it wasn't alone. And neither was he. Days passed. The bobcat remained cautious, but didn't resist the young man's care. Slowly, it regained some strength. It ate. It drank. It even started moving around the cabin, stretching its sore muscles. The young man observed everything, fascinated by the way the animal carried itself, its quiet resilience, its sharp eyes that missed nothing. One evening, as he sat by the fire, the bobcat curled up near his feet, closer than ever before. A small smile tugged at his lips. "You need a name," he mused aloud. The bobcat lifted its head slightly, as if waiting. "How about Ash?" The name felt right. The bobcat's fur was a mix of tawny browns and soft grays, like the ashes left behind a fire. But more than that, Ash had survived, just like embers buried beneath the ashes, waiting for the right moment to reignite. The bobcat didn't protest. It simply laid its head back down, eyes closing in quiet acceptance. The young man leaned back, watching the flames flicker. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was just the beginning. Ash wasn't just surviving anymore. He was about to change everything. That night, the young man woke to a strange sound, a low, rumbling growl. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, but when he opened his eyes, he saw Ash, standing near the door, ears perked, body tense. The growl deepened, throatier this time. The young man sat up, heart pounding. "What is it?" Ash didn't look at him. His golden eyes were fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. The young man grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the window. He flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the darkness outside. At first, he saw nothing, just trees, shifting slightly in the wind. But then, a shadow moved. Something was out there. A prickle ran down his spine. He reached for the shotgun mounted above the fireplace, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. Ash growled again, his tail flicking sharply. The young man stepped toward the door. His fingers tightened around the handle, debating whether to open it. The night was silent, too silent. He inhaled, steadying himself. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The young man exhaled, muscles still tense. He lowered the gun slightly, glancing at Ash. "Guess you're not as weak as they thought, huh?" he murmured. The bobcat blinked up at him. There was something in its eyes, something sharp, intelligent, something that made the young man wonder if maybe, just maybe, he hadn't saved Ash. Maybe Ash had saved him. And for the first time, he realized whatever had just happened was only the beginning. Morning light filtered through the trees, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor of the cabin. The young man stirred awake, his mind still replaying the events of the night before. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes before glancing toward the fireplace. Ash was there, curled up tightly, but his ears twitched at the slightest sound. The young man could tell the bobcat was still alert, still listening. Whatever had been outside last night, it had unsettled him too. The young man stood up, stretching his sore muscles before walking to the kitchen area. He poured some water into a tin bowl and set it near Ash, who flicked his tail but didn't move. "Still thinking about it, huh?" The man muttered, grabbing a loaf of bread and tearing off a piece for himself. "Me too." Ash finally raised his head. Golden eyes locked onto him. The bobcat had changed in the past few days. His fur was no longer dull and matted. Though still thin, it had regained some of its natural shine. His body, once frail, now carried a hint of strength beneath the surface. The young man could see it. Ash wasn't just recovering. He was learning, and he was watching everything. As the morning passed, the young man stepped outside to check the surroundings. The cold breeze carried the scent of damp earth and pine, but there was something else, too. Something faint. Footprints. Not human. He crouched down, running his fingers along the edge of one. It was deep, heavier than a wolf's, yet not quite like any other predator he had seen around these parts. He frowned. Something had been watching them. Something big. A rustling sound made him turn sharply. Ash had followed him outside, standing near the cabin door. His tail flicked once, his gaze fixed on the trees. The young man exhaled. "You feel it too, don't you?" Ash didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The young man straightened up, scanning the tree line. Whatever it wasn't here now, but it had been, and it would be back. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Looks like we're not alone out here." Ash blinked, then padded forward a few steps before sitting down. His muscles were no longer trembling. His body no longer looked fragile. The young man noticed it then, really noticed it. The bobcat wasn't the same animal he had brought home from the auction house. He had been discarded, treated as nothing. But here, he was becoming something else, something stronger. The young man let out a breath. "Guess we'd better be ready for whatever's coming." Ash didn't move. But for the first time, the young man thought he saw something different in his eyes. Not fear, not weakness. Something sharp, something unbreakable. And somehow he knew this was only the beginning. The rest of the morning passed in quiet tension. The young man busied himself with chores around the cabin, but his mind remained preoccupied with the footprints he had seen. The size of them, the depth, whatever had been lurking outside, wasn't a normal predator. Ash stayed close. He didn't cower inside the cabin like a frightened house cat. He followed the young man, his movements cautious yet deliberate. It was as if he had shifted from a passive survivor to an active guardian overnight. The young man didn't know what to make of it. By midday, the sun hung high in the sky, though its warmth barely reached to the chilling autumn air. The young man took the opportunity to gather more firewood, hauling heavy logs from the stack near the shed. As he worked, Ash sat on a nearby rock, his golden gaze sweeping the surroundings. Then, suddenly, a snap. The young man froze, his muscles tightening. Ash's ears flattened, his body lowering instinctively into a crouch. The sound had come from the woods, deep within the shadows. Not the wind, not a falling branch. Something alive. The young man slowly reached for the axe embedded in a stump nearby. He wasn't afraid of normal predators. He had dealt with wolves, coyotes, even bears before. But this was different. Ash growled low, the sound almost inaudible but filled with warning. Then movement. A figure shifted between the trees, just beyond the line of sight. A hulking shadow, slow and deliberate. The young man's grip on the axe tightened. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Whatever this was, it was watching them. A long silence followed. The woods held its breath. Even the wind seemed to die, as if the entire forest was waiting for something to happen. Then, a single step, a heavy, deliberate step. The young man inhaled sharply. But just as quickly as it had come, the presence withdrew. The shadow disappeared, fading into the depths of the trees. The young man remained frozen for a few moments, his grip on the axe unrelenting. Ash, too, was still, his body coiled like a spring. Then, finally, the tension broke. The forest seemed to breathe again. The wind returned, rustling the branches. The birds, long silent, resumed their distant calls. But the young man knew that wasn't the end. Something was out there, and it wasn't done with them yet. He exhaled, glancing down at Ash. The bobcat's golden eyes met his, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The cabin stood in eerie silence, wrapped in the embrace of the darkening woods. The young man worked methodically, securing the door with heavy wooden planks, stacking more firewood, and ensuring his rifle was loaded. He had lived alone in these wild lands for years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, something unnatural lurked beyond the trees, and it was waiting. Ash remained close, his golden eyes locked onto Treeline. Every flick of his tail, every twitch of his ears signaled tension. He wasn't the same weak, discarded creature the young man had brought home. He had changed. He was aware now, alert, sensing something unseen. A gust of wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, making the wooden structure groan. The young man glanced at Ash. "You feel it, don't you?" he murmured. Ash didn't move, but his ears flattened slightly. The young man tightened his grip on his knife. Then the first sign came, a distant growl. Deep, guttural. It rumbled through the trees like distant thunder, vibrating in his chest. The young man stiffened, his breath slowing. Another growl. Closer. Ash tensed, his muscles coiling beneath his sleek fur. The young man took a slow step toward the window, peering through the fog glass. The night had swallowed the forest whole, but movement flickered between the trees. Large, heavy, deliberate. Something was coming. Then a loud thump against the cabin wall. The young man spun toward the sound, rifle raised. Ash let out a low snarl, his fur standing on end. Another thump, then another. Something massive pressed against the wood, testing its strength. The young man swallowed hard. Whatever was out, there wasn't hunting for food. It was hunting them. The air grew still, thick with tension. The young man's grip on the rifle tightened, his knuckles white. Then the door shuddered. A long, slow, scraping sound followed as claws dragged against the wood. The young man's pulse thundered in his ears. His mind raced, calculating. If it broke through, he had seconds, maybe less, to react. A deep, rattling breath came from the other side of the door. Ash crouched, his tail flicking once. The young man recognized the stance. It wasn't fear. It was preparation. A sudden, violent crack as the door splintered. The young man stepped back, aiming his rifle. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced wildly across the walls. Then the door burst open. A massive, hulking figure lunged inside. The beast was unlike anything he had ever seen. Dark, matted fur covered its body, thick and tangled. Eyes burned like molten embers, locking onto them with eerie intelligence. Its shoulders were broad, its limbs unnaturally long, claws sharp enough to slice through bone. The young man barely had time to process before. Ash moved. The bobcat launched forward like a streak of fire, his body twisting midair. He collided with the beast, claws raking deep. The creature roared, the cabin shaking from the sheer force of its fury. Ash didn't falter. The young man fired. The bullet struck the creature's side, but it barely stumbled. Ash landed on the ground, crouched low, his tail flicking. He had drawn blood, but it wasn't enough. The beast turned toward him, snarling. The young man's breath caught. Ash! Before he could react, the bobcat lunged again, faster, fiercer. He was no longer a frail animal, no longer the discarded creature no one had wanted. He was something else now, something lethal. The beast swiped, but Ash ducked, slipping under its massive limb. His claws found flesh again, tearing through its thick hide. Blood sprayed across the wooden floor. The young man fired another shot. This time, the creature staggered. Ash took his chance. With a final vicious leap, he sank his teeth into the beast's throat. A deafening roar filled the cabin, rattling the very walls. The beast twisted, fighting, but Ash held on. The young man fired one last time. The creature let out a final, gurgling snarl, then collapsed. Silence. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the broken door. The cabin, moments ago filled with chaos, now stood still. Ash released his grip, panting, blood dripping from his fur. The young man lowered his rifle, his breath unsteady. They had survived. Ash turned to him, golden eyes meeting his, and in that moment, the young man saw the truth. This wasn't just survival. This was a rebirth. Ash had been discarded, rejected, treated as worthless. But tonight, he had proven them all wrong. The night had been long, but the battle was over. The young man stood amidst the wreckage of his cabin, breathless, his heart still pounding from the fight. Blood stained the wooden floor, but none of it was his. The monstrous beast lay motionless, its dark fur matted with its own blood. And standing over it, victorious, was Ash. The bobcat's sleek body rose and fell with deep, steady breaths. His golden eyes gleamed in the dim light, his fur bristling, his muscles tense. But something had changed. This wasn't the same fragile animal the young man had rescued from rejection. Ash was a warrior now. The young man lowered his rifle, his fingers trembling. He stepped forward cautiously, kneeling beside Ash. The bobcat's body bore scratches and bruises, signs of the battle he had fought, but his spirit remained unbroken. The young man reached out, brushing his fingers against Ash's fur. "You saved us," he whispered. Ash let out a low, satisfied growl, then turned his gaze toward the open doorway. The wind howled outside, rustling the trees. The forest had been watching, waiting, as if holding its breath. The young man exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had always believed in the strength of nature, in the wild creatures that roamed these lands. But never had he seen an animal defy the odds like Ash had. Rejection at the auction, labeled as weak, cast aside. But now, the world would know what they had overlooked. Ash wasn't just a bobcat. He was something more. The next morning, the young man wasted no time. He wrapped Ash's wounds with careful hands, making sure the bobcat was comfortable. Then, he did something he had never planned to do. He told the world. Through a video recorded on his old camera, he shared Ash's story. From the day he had been rejected at the auction to the moment he had saved them both from a monster in the wild. This was the bobcat they thought wasn't worth anything, he said into the camera. They called him weak. They called him useless. But look at him now. He turned the camera to Ash, who sat proudly beside him. His wounds were healing, but his eyes burned with a fierce, untamed spirit. He's not just some animal. He's a survivor. The video went online, spreading faster than the young man had expected. Viewers were captivated. How could they have rejected him? This is the most incredible story I've ever heard. That bobcat is a legend. News stations picked it up. Wildlife organizations reached out. People who had never cared about bobcats before were now talking about Ash, about resilience, about how sometimes the most overlooked souls carried the greatest strength. Weeks passed, and Ash grew stronger. His once weakened body now held the power of a true predator. But he wasn't just a wild animal anymore. He was something more, something that had captured the hearts of people everywhere. The young man received invitations to bring Ash to wildlife sanctuaries, to speak about his journey, to educate others about how animals like him deserved a second chance. But as he looked at Ash, at the way the bobcat still stared toward the forest, he knew Ash didn't belong in cages, no matter how well-intentioned they were. He belonged to the wild. So one final time, the young man and Ash stood at the edge of the forest, the place where it had all begun. Ash glanced up at him, golden eyes unblinking. The young man smiled. "You were never weak, were you?" Ash let out a deep, almost knowing purr. Then, with one final flick of his tail, he turned and disappeared into the wild. The young man watched him go, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. He had saved Ash, yes, but in the end, Ash had saved him too. And as he turned back toward his cabin, he knew one thing for sure. The world would never forget the bobcat that no one had wanted.